Some mornings you wake up thinking it's just another ordinary day, never knowing it's the day that will change everything forever. Laura Brennan had walked these northern Idaho mountain trails for 15 years with her German Shepherd Scout, finding peace in the wilderness after losing her husband to cancer 3 years earlier. On this quiet October morning, Scout suddenly stops and sits firmly beside two strange metal pipes sticking up from the forest floor. The rusted steel tubes look old and weathered, but they're too straight and deliberate to be natural. Laura kneels down and brushes away the fallen leaves, realizing these aren't just random pieces of junk. They're going deep underground to something that was meant to stay hidden. What she discovers beneath these peaceful woods will uncover a secret that her small mountain town has been trying to forget for 60 years. What could be so important that someone buried it this deep in the wilderness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine boughs like memories that refused to fade, and Laura Brennan breathed it in with the familiar ache of someone who had learned to find beauty in solitude. Her cabin sat nestled against the mountainside like a wooden prayer, its weathered cedar walls bearing witness to 15 years of seasons that had slowly taught her the difference between being alone and being lonely. Scout padded beside her on the narrow trail, his grey muzzle showing the wisdom of their shared years. At 9 years old, the German Shepherd had been her constant companion through the hardest chapters of her life, and his steady presence had become as essential as breathing. His ears perked at every forest sound, the rustle of a chipmunk, the distant call of a hawk, the whisper of wind through ancient pines, but his eyes always returned to Laura, watching over her with the devotion that only comes from surviving loss together. The trail beneath their feet was more than packed earth and fallen needles. It was a lifeline. Every morning for 3 years, since David's death, Laura had walked these paths to keep herself tethered to the world. In the beginning, when grief felt like drowning, these walks had been desperate gasps for air. Now they were something deeper, a meditation, a conversation with the mountains that had become her closest confidants. Her hand brushed against the smooth wood of David's walking stick, the one she carried every morning. He had carved it himself from a fallen oak, spending winter evenings by the fire, shaping it with the patience that had drawn her to him 32 years ago. The handle bore the wear of countless miles, and sometimes when she gripped it, she could almost feel his calloused fingers overlapping hers. "Just you and me today." "A boy," she murmured to Scout, who responded with a soft wag of understanding. The morning air held that crisp bite of October, sharp enough to remind her that winter was settling into the mountains, patient and inevitable. Laura had always been a woman who found comfort in patterns. Her life in Millbrook Falls had been built on reliable rhythms: morning coffee at 5:30, walks by 6, afternoons spent tending her small garden or reading on the porch. She taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school for 28 years before David's illness changed everything. Now at 53, she lived on his pension and her small savings, finding richness in simplicity that would have surprised her younger self. The town below remained largely unchanged since she and David had first settled here. Millbrook Falls claimed barely 800 residents, most of whom had been there for decades. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your story, where the post office doubled as the center of local news, and where Mrs. Henley still baked pies for newcomers. Even though newcomers rarely came, Tom Morrison still ran the hardware store his father had opened in 1952. Betty Chen had served the same breakfast specials at the Millbrook Diner for 23 years. Dr. Richards had delivered half the babies in town and still made house calls when needed. There was something both comforting and slightly suffocating about such constancy, like living inside a snow globe where the scenery never changed, but the seasons still turned. Laura's neighbors, Frank and Marion Caldwell, lived a quarter-mile down the mountain road in a log house Frank had built with his own hands. They checked on her regularly, with the gentle persistence of people who understood that grief was not something you got over, but something you learned to carry. Marion brought homemade bread twice a week, and Frank kept her firewood stocked without being asked. They never mentioned David directly anymore, but his absence sat comfortably among them, like an old friend. The forest around her cabin held layers of memory. She and David had hiked every trail within 20 miles, marking the seasons by which wildflowers bloomed and which streams ran strongest. He'd been a man who noticed things, the way morning light caught spiderwebs, the calls of different birds, the subtle signs that told him when weather was changing. His love for these mountains had been infectious, and even now, 3 years after his death, she felt him most clearly among the trees. Their marriage had been one of those quiet success stories that didn't make for dramatic tales but created the kind of steady happiness that becomes invisible until it's gone. They had never had children, not by choice initially, then later by the cruel mathematics of missed chances and medical complications that left them with each other and the wilderness they both loved. David always said the mountains were their children, requiring attention and care, offering beauty and surprises in return. His death had been mercifully swift for him, devastatingly sudden for her. Lung cancer, despite never smoking a day in his life. 6 months from diagnosis to the end. 6 months of watching the strongest man she knew become fragile as autumn leaves. He faced it with the same quiet dignity he had brought to everything else, making her promise to stay in the mountains, to keep walking, to remember that grief was just love with nowhere to go. The local community had wrapped around her like a protective blanket in those first months. Casseroles appeared on her doorstep. Cards filled her mailbox. Dr. Richards checked on her with the gentle persistence of someone who had watched grief claim too many good people. But gradually, as grief does, her sharp edges had softened into something more manageable, and life had found a new rhythm. Her mornings began before dawn, with coffee brewed strong the way David had taught her. She would sit on the porch in all weather, watching the sky lighten over the peaks, listening to the forest wake up. Scout would rest his chin on her knee, patient as sunrise, until she was ready to walk. These moments of stillness had become sacred, the closest thing to prayer she had ever known. The trails they walked varied with her mood and the weather. On days when grief felt heavy, she chose the gentle loops that stayed close to home. When restlessness took hold, she ventured farther, following ridgelines that offered glimpses of distant valleys. Today felt like a middle-distance kind of morning, far enough to stretch her legs and clear her head, close enough to be back before the afternoon clouds gathered. Scout's sudden alertness pulled her from her reverie. His ears stood sharp, his body tense with the focused attention of a dog who had caught something unexpected. She followed his gaze to see what had captured his interest, expecting perhaps a deer or the flash of a fox. Instead, she found herself staring at something that didn't belong in her familiar landscape. 2 metal pipes jutted from the forest floor like stubborn fingers pointing at the sky. They were perhaps 4 feet apart, each rising about 18 inches above the ground, their surfaces weathered to the deep rust orange of old metal left to the elements. But there was something deliberate about their placement, something too purposeful to be debris or accident. "What do you think, Scout?" she asked, approaching slowly. The dog remained seated but alert, his tail still, his dark eyes fixed on the pipes with an intensity that made her pause. Scout had never been a fearful dog, but he had always possessed an intuitive wisdom about things that didn't feel right. The pipes were clearly old, decades old by the look of them, but their positioning was too precise to be random. They weren't bent or damaged, weren't scattered by weather or animals. They stood like sentries, marking something that had been deliberately placed and forgotten. Laura knelt beside them, her fingers tracing the cold metal. The pipes were substantial, not the thin tubing of modern plumbing, but heavy-gauge steel that spoke of serious construction. One appeared slightly larger than the other, and when she peered down into them, she could see they extended deep into the earth. disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow her gaze. The ground around the pipes showed no obvious disturbance, no signs of recent digging or construction. Decades of fallen leaves and forest debris had accumulated around their base, suggesting they had been here far longer than she had been walking these trails. But how had she never noticed them before? This section of forest was one of her regular routes, a path she had walked hundreds of times. Scout whined softly, a sound she recognized as unease. He remained at a respectful distance, neither approaching nor retreating, but his posture suggested these pipes represented something worth watching carefully. Dogs, Laura had learned, often sense things before people did, their instincts unclouded by the human tendency to rationalize away discomfort. As she studied the pipes more closely, she noticed something else that made her pulse quicken. The ground around them wasn't quite level. There were subtle depressions, barely visible unless you looked carefully, that suggested something larger lay beneath the surface. The pipes weren't random placement. They were part of something bigger, something buried. The morning sun, now fully above the tree line, cast sharp shadows that revealed details she might have missed in dimmer light. The area around the pipes showed faint traces of geometric patterns in the earth, straight lines too regular to be natural. It was as if someone had tried to disguise extensive construction, allowing nature to reclaim the surface while leaving these two pipes as the only visible evidence of what lay beneath. Laura felt the familiar tingle of curiosity that had always driven her to flip stones and peer into hollow logs during their walks. David had teased her about it, calling her his detective, but he had shared her fascination with mysteries. Now, kneeling beside these strange sentries in the forest, she could almost hear his voice encouraging her to dig deeper, to find the story they were telling. But something else stirred within her as she stared at the pipes, a feeling she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear exactly, but a recognition that she had stumbled across something significant, something that had been waiting in the quiet forest for someone to notice. The pipes seemed to pulse with possibility, with secrets that had been sleeping in the earth, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Standing slowly, her knees protesting the motion, Laura made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, she would return with tools, with supplies, with the determination to understand what these pipes were guarding. The mountains had given her solace in her darkest time. Perhaps they had one more gift to offer. Scout rose when she did, shaking himself as if awakening from a dream. But as they turned to continue their walk, he looked back over his shoulder at the pipes, his expression troubled in the way that dogs sometimes seem to glimpse futures their humans cannot yet see. The rest of their walk passed in comfortable silence, but Laura's mind remained fixed on those two weathered sentinels. Whatever they marked, whatever they protected, she felt certain it was meant for her to find. After 3 years of walking in circles around her grief, she had finally encountered something that pointed in a new direction. By the time they returned to the cabin, the morning mist had burned away completely, leaving the mountains sharp and clear against the autumn sky. Laura made her second cup of coffee and sat on the porch with Scout at her feet, but her eyes kept drifting toward the trail that led back to those mysterious pipes. David's walking stick leaned against her chair, its familiar weight a comfort and a promise. Tomorrow she decided she would take it with her again. But tomorrow, instead of simply walking past whatever lay buried in the forest, she would begin the work of bringing it into the light. Some discoveries she was beginning to understand were worth the wait. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Laura had packed her day bag with deliberate care, a small folding shovel from her gardening supplies, work gloves, a flashlight, and a thermos of coffee that steamed in the cool air. Scout seemed to sense the change in routine, his usual relaxed morning demeanor replaced by heightened alertness. The walk to the pipes felt different this time, charged with purpose rather than meditation. Every step brought her closer to answers she wasn't sure she wanted to find. Scout trotted ahead, then circled back, his behavior more restless than usual, as if he too felt the pull of whatever waited in the forest. When they reached the site, Laura set down her pack and studied the pipes with fresh eyes. In the clear morning light, details emerged that she had missed the day before. The metal showed signs of careful construction, welded joints, professional installation, the kind of workmanship that spoke of official purpose rather than amateur effort. These weren't leftover farm equipment or forgotten utility lines. Someone had built them to last. She pulled on her work gloves and began clearing away the accumulated debris around the base of the larger pipe. Decades of fallen leaves, pine needles, and forest litter had created a thick carpet that came away in chunks, revealing more of the metal structure beneath. The pipe extended at least 3 feet into the ground, possibly deeper, and was anchored by what appeared to be a concrete collar. Scout maintained his distance, sitting perfectly still about 10 feet away. His dark eyes never left her work, but something in his posture suggested he was listening for sounds she couldn't hear, watching for movement she couldn't see. Dogs possessed senses that reached beyond human perception, and his unease made her work more carefully, more quietly. As she dug around the second pipe, her shovel struck something that rang with metallic resonance. Not the dull thud of buried debris, but the clear note of substantial metal. She worked more carefully now, using her hands to brush away soil and reveal what lay beneath. A metal grate, heavy gauge steel mesh, covered an opening in the ground between the 2 pipes. The grate was hinged on one side and secured with what had once been a padlock, though decades of weather had reduced the lock to rusted fragments that crumbled at her touch. Laura's pulse quickened as she realized she was looking at an entrance, a deliberate access point to something underground. The grate lifted with surprising ease, despite its weight, revealing a dark shaft that dropped straight down into the earth. The 2 pipes, she now understood, were ventilation shafts, one for fresh air intake, one for exhaust. Someone had built a space underground that required proper airflow for human occupation. She shone her flashlight into the opening, its beam revealing concrete walls that descended at least 12 feet before disappearing into a horizontal passage. The construction was professional, permanent, built to withstand time and weather. This wasn't a storm cellar or root cellar. This was something far more substantial. A wave of cool air rose from the shaft, carrying with it a smell that made her step back instinctively. Not the damp earthiness of natural caves or the mustiness of old basements, but something metallic and processed, like the lingering scent of machinery that had been shut down for a very long time. Mixed with it was something else, the faintest trace of what might have been disinfectant or cleaning chemicals, so faded as to be almost imaginary. Scout whined softly, a sound filled with concern. He'd moved closer despite his obvious reluctance, drawn by the same mixture of curiosity and unease that was pulling Laura toward the opening. But when she looked at him, his expression was clear. This was not a place they should enter. Laura sat back on her heels, trying to process what she had uncovered. Someone had built an underground facility in the middle of what now seemed like pristine wilderness. The construction was sophisticated, designed for long-term use, requiring ventilation systems that suggested people had lived or worked there for extended periods. But when? And why here, miles from the nearest road in forest that showed no signs of the heavy equipment such construction would have required? She examined the grate more carefully, looking for any identifying marks or dates. In one corner, barely visible beneath decades of corrosion, she found what appeared to be numbers stamped into the metal. 1962. The date hit her like a cold wind. 1962, the height of the Cold War, the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when nuclear fears reached fever pitch and the government encouraged citizens to build bomb shelters in their backyards. But this was no backyard bomb shelter. The scale of construction, the location, the sophisticated ventilation system, this had been built by people with resources and authority. This had been built by the government. Laura's mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. A military installation, a research facility, a shelter for government officials during nuclear crisis? The remote location made sense if secrecy had been paramount, but how had such a substantial project remained hidden from the local community. She thought of the older residents of Millbrook Falls, people who had lived in the area their entire lives. Had they known? Had they been sworn to secrecy? Or had the project been conducted with such discretion that even the locals remained unaware? The timing suggested it had been built during a period of national paranoia, when government secrecy was accepted as necessary for national security. A rustling in the trees nearby made both Laura and Scout freeze. The sound came again, not the random movement of wind through branches, but the deliberate passage of something large. Scout's ears perked forward, his body tense with alert attention. Laura reached for her flashlight, though she realized with sudden clarity how vulnerable she was, alone in the forest, with evidence of something that had been meant to stay hidden. The rustling stopped. The forest returned to its normal symphony of small sounds: birds, insects, the whisper of breeze through pine needles. But the moment had crystallized something for Laura. Whatever she had discovered, it was significant enough that someone might not want it found. She looked down into the dark shaft again, fighting the urge to climb down immediately. The concrete walls looked solid, the construction sound despite its age. But Scout's continued unease, and her own growing sense that she was crossing a line, made her hesitate. This felt like a threshold, a point beyond which her quiet life might never be the same. Yet something deeper than curiosity was driving her forward. Perhaps it was the same instinct that had made David carve his walking stick with such care, the human need to leave lasting marks, to create meaning that outlasts individual lives. Someone had built this place for reasons that seemed important enough to justify enormous effort and expense. Those reasons, and the people who had acted on them, deserved to be remembered. Laura made her decision. She would explore further, but not today, not alone, and not without better preparation. Whatever lay in the darkness below had waited decades for discovery. It could wait another day or two while she gathered proper equipment and considered her approach more carefully. She carefully lowered the grate back into place, its weight settling with a solid thunk that seemed to echo in the forest air. The pipes stood sentinel once again, keeping their vigil over whatever secrets lay buried beneath the peaceful forest floor. But as she gathered her tools and prepared to leave, Laura felt a subtle shift in her relationship with these mountains. They were no longer just the place where she came to heal from grief. They had become the guardian of mysteries that reached back through decades, touching lives and events she was only beginning to imagine. Scout rose eagerly when she shouldered her pack, clearly relieved to be leaving the site. But as they started back toward the cabin, Laura noticed something that made her steps falter. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the soft earth, was the unmistakable impression of a boot print that hadn't been there the day before. Someone else knew about the pipes. Someone else had been watching. The walk home passed in thoughtful silence, but Laura's mind was far from quiet. She had stumbled onto something that connected her peaceful mountain community to events and decisions made during one of the most frightening periods in American history. The question that haunted her steps was simple but troubling. If this place had been secret then, who might want to keep it secret now? By the time she reached her cabin, the morning sun had climbed high enough to burn off the last of the mountain mist. But for Laura, the day felt like it was just beginning. She had crossed a line from which there was no return, and whatever came next would require more courage than she had needed since the day David died. Scout settled on the porch with obvious relief, but his eyes remained alert, turned toward the trail that led back to the pipes. Some discoveries, Laura was learning, changed everything about the world you thought you knew. The Millbrook Falls Public Library occupied a converted Victorian house on Maple Street, its tall windows and wraparound porch giving it the comfortable appearance of a place where stories lived and breathed. Laura had always loved libraries, but today she approached the building with the focused intensity of someone seeking answers rather than escape. Mrs. Eleanor Vance had been the head librarian for 38 years, a woman whose steel-grey hair and quiet demeanor masked an encyclopedic knowledge of local history and an intuitive sense of when someone needed more than books. She She looked up from her desk as Laura entered, her sharp eyes noting the unusual tension in a patron she had known for 2 decades. "Laura, dear, you look like someone with questions on your mind." "I am, Eleanor. I'm hoping you can help me understand something about local history. Specifically, anything that might have happened in the early 1960s involving federal government activity in the area." Eleanor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the slight stiffening that comes when a casual conversation takes an unexpected turn. "That's quite specific. May I ask what's prompted this interest?" Laura had prepared for this question during her restless night, weighing how much to reveal. "I've been walking the same trails for years, and I noticed something that doesn't seem to fit with the area's natural history. Some kind of construction that looks like it might date from that time period." "Construction?" Eleanor's voice carried a careful neutrality. "Where exactly?" "Up in the forest area north of my place, maybe 3 miles from the main trail. I found what appeared to be ventilation pipes, very old, possibly military grade. The silence that followed stretched just long enough to be noticeable." Eleanor's fingers drummed once against her desk blotter, then stilled. "I see. Well, let's see what we can find in the historical records, shall we?" The local history section occupied a corner of the library's main room, its wooden shelves holding bound volumes of town meeting minutes, newspaper clippings, and photograph collections that chronicled Millbrook Falls' quiet evolution. Eleanor pulled several volumes from the 1960s, setting them on a nearby table with movements that seemed more deliberate than necessary. "These contain the official records from that period," she said, then paused. "Though you should know that official records don't always tell the complete story." Laura spent the next 2 hours working through bound copies of the Millbrook Falls Gazette, the weekly newspaper that had documented local events since 1923. The gay, early 1960s pages revealed a community dealing with the same tensions that gripped the entire nation: civil defense drills, fallout shelter construction recommendations, anxious discussions about nuclear preparedness, but she noticed gaps, missing issues from September and October 1962, with no explanation for their absence. When she asked Eleanor about it, the librarian's response was measured and careful. There was a period when the newspaper suspended publication temporarily. "Equipment problems, I believe," Laura continued reading, finding scattered references to federal consultation and emergency preparedness initiatives that were mentioned but never explained in detail. A September 1962 town meeting notice referenced discussion of civil defense cooperation, but the meeting minutes themselves were missing from the record. More telling were the things that weren't mentioned. For a community where the arrival of a new family or the opening of a business warranted front-page coverage, the complete absence of any reference to construction activity during this period seemed deliberate. No permits, no contractor advertisements, no complaints about heavy equipment or disrupted roads. "Eleanor," Laura said finally, "it's almost as if someone deliberately removed information from these records." The older woman joined her at the table, her fingers tracing the edge of a newspaper page. "Laura, you have to understand that those were different times. People believed that some information was too sensitive for general knowledge, that national security required certain sacrifices from local communities. You're speaking as if you remember this personally." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on a photograph of the town's main street from 1962. "I was 22 years old that fall, just married, working as a secretary for the town council. There were things that happened that we were asked not to discuss, not to record in official minutes. We were told it was patriotic duty." Laura felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of things?" "Federal representatives came through town several times that autumn. They met with local officials, with certain landowners. There were discussions about temporary land use, about cooperation with national emergency procedures. We were told that some activities might be necessary for the greater good, but that the success of these activities depended on community discretion." Community discretion meaning silence, meaning trust. Trust that our government knew what was best during a very frightening time. Eleanor's voice carried the weight of someone who had spent decades questioning decisions made in youth. The Cuban Missile Crisis had everyone terrified. When officials told us that certain preparations were necessary, that certain projects required secrecy for national security, most people didn't ask questions. We were scared enough to believe that someone in authority had a plan. Laura leaned forward. What happened to the families who owned land in the area where I found the pipes? Eleanor was quiet for so long that Laura thought she might not answer. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. The Morrison family had a homestead up in that area, been there since the 1920s. Jim Morrison, his wife Kate, their 2 children. They told people they were moving to Oregon to be closer to Kate's family. But Kate's family had never been to Oregon. They were from Montana, had a ranch outside Billings. I knew because Kate and I had been friends since childhood. Eleanor's fingers twisted together. I asked her about it when they came to town to say goodbye. She looked terrified, Laura, absolutely terrified. She said they couldn't talk about it, that they'd been asked to start fresh somewhere else, that it was for the good of the country. The weight of implications settled between them like dust in sunlight. Laura thought of the concrete shaft, the sophisticated ventilation system, the evidence of long-term human habitation she had sensed but not yet confirmed. Eleanor, do you think the Morrison family was relocated because the government needed their land? I think the Morrison family was relocated because the government needed them gone, Eleanor replied. And I think they weren't the only ones. Laura spent another hour reviewing property records, finding transfers and sales that created a pattern of government land acquisition throughout the area during late 1962 and early 1963. The transactions were legal, properly documented, but uniformly involved families who had lived on the land for generations, suddenly selling to federal agencies for undisclosed purposes. As she prepared to leave, Eleanor caught her arm gently. Laura, you seem like someone who's determined to pursue this further. If you are, you should know that some of the people involved in those decisions are still alive, still living in this community. And some of them might not appreciate having those decisions examined too closely. The warning was clear, delivered with the gentle firmness of someone who cared about Laura's welfare. But it also confirmed what Laura had suspected. Since finding the boot print near the pipes, her investigation had not gone unnoticed. Walking home through the afternoon light, Laura's mind worked through the implications of what she had learned. A pattern of forced relocations, missing records, and deliberate secrecy pointed to something far more significant than a simple civil defense shelter. The federal government had cleared families from their land, erased the documentation, and built something substantial enough to require sophisticated infrastructure. The faded radiation warning sign she had glimpsed in the shaft suddenly took on new meaning. This hadn't been just about nuclear preparedness. This had been about creating a secret facility that required the complete removal of local residents who might ask questions or witness activities. Scout greeted her return with his usual enthusiasm, but his behavior around the house that evening remained restless. He spent long minutes staring out windows toward the forest, his body tense with an alertness that suggested he sensed things beyond Laura's perception. As night fell over the mountains, Laura sat on her porch with a cup of tea, David's walking stick beside her chair. The forest stretched dark and quiet beyond her porch light, holding its secrets close. But now she knew those secrets had names, had families who had been displaced, had official decisions made in rooms where ordinary citizens weren't allowed to ask questions. Tomorrow, she decided she would return to the shaft, armed with historical context and growing certainty that what lay underground connected to one of the most shameful chapters in her community's past. She felt ready to descend into whatever truth waited in the darkness below. Laura descended into the shaft with careful deliberation, her headlamp cutting through darkness that seemed to swallow light hungrily. The concrete walls were smooth and professionally finished, bearing the unmistakable marks of government construction, precise, functional, built to last decades. Scout had refused to follow her down, remaining at the surface with obvious distress. His whining echoing through the opening above. The horizontal passage stretched ahead, wide enough for two people to walk side by side, with conduit running along the ceiling that had once carried electrical cables. Her footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, the sound bouncing off walls that seemed to absorb and reflect her presence simultaneously. 30 feet from the entrance shaft, the passage opened into a larger chamber that took her breath away. This wasn't a simple shelter. It was an underground complex designed for extended habitation. The room stretched approximately 40 feet square, with a ceiling high enough that her headlamp beam barely reached it. Along the walls, she could make out the remnants of what had once been living spaces, kitchen facilities and storage areas, but it was the personal belongings scattered throughout the space that stopped her completely. A small wooden box sat on what had been a kitchen counter, its contents preserved by the dry underground air. Laura opened it with trembling fingers, finding a collection of family photographs, letters, and personal documents that painted a picture of lives interrupted by forces beyond their control. The photographs showed the Morrison family Eleanor had mentioned, Jim and Kate Morrison with their children. A boy of perhaps 10 and a girl slightly younger, posed in front of a log cabin that Laura now realized had probably stood somewhere above this underground refuge. The letters, written in Kate Morrison's careful handwriting, were addressed to her sister in Montana, but apparently never sent. They described the fear and confusion of being asked to leave their land for national security purposes. The promise that they would be relocated to a safe community where they could continue their lives without worry, but the dates on the letters, spanning several months, told a different story, a story of people who had been moved not to safety, but to secrecy. One letter, dated November 15, 1962, made Laura's hands shake as she read, "We've been here almost 2 months now, and still no word about when we can contact the family. The children ask every day when they can go back to school, when they can see their friends." Jim tries to stay positive, but I can see the worry in his eyes. "The officials say this is temporary, that we're helping protect the country, but it feels more like we've disappeared from the world entirely." Another box contained children's toys and school books, including a diary belonging to the Morrison girl, Sarah. The entries were heartbreaking in their innocence. Day 23 underground. "Daddy says we're like explorers living in a cave, but I miss the sky. I miss our chickens. Mama cries when she thinks we're not looking." The diary entries continued sporadically through the winter months, documenting a family trying to maintain normalcy while living in artificial light, breathing recycled air, isolated from the world they had known. The final entry, dated March 10, 1963, was written in a different hand, Jim Morrison's. "Kate is sick. The medicine they gave us isn't helping. The children need fresh air, need sunlight. They promised this was temporary. They lied." Laura sat in the empty underground room, surrounded by the ghosts of the Morrison family, trying to process the magnitude of what she had discovered. This hadn't been a voluntary relocation program. This had been forced imprisonment, disguised as patriotic duty, justified by national security concerns that had allowed officials to treat American families like expendable resources. She explored deeper into the complex, finding sleeping quarters that had housed multiple families, a medical facility with equipment that suggested serious health concerns among the residents, and storage rooms filled with supplies that indicated the underground facility had been designed for long-term occupation. Government documents scattered throughout the space revealed the project's official designation, Project Silent Valley, a civil defense initiative designed to protect essential civilian populations during nuclear crisis. But the documents also revealed the project's darker reality. Families hadn't been selected for protection, they had been selected for removal. The underground facility wasn't a shelter for the chosen few. It was a prison for the inconvenient many, people whose presence on the surface might have complicated other government activities in the area. A manila folder marked medical observations contained records that made Laura sick to her stomach. Detailed notes about the psychological and physical effects of prolonged underground isolation, documented like a clinical study. The Morrison children had been among the subjects. Their adaptation to confinement carefully monitored and recorded by medical personnel who seemed to view them as experimental subjects rather than human beings. The medical records revealed declining health among all the residents, vitamin D deficiency, respiratory problems from recycled air, psychological deterioration from extended confinement. Children showed symptoms of developmental regression. Adults exhibited increasing signs of depression and anxiety. Yet the observations continued month after month, as if the suffering of these families was valuable data worth collecting. Laura found herself crying as she read Sarah Morrison's final diary entry, written in a child's unsteady handwriting. "Mama died yesterday. The doctor man said her heart stopped, but I think she died from missing the sun. They say we might go up to the surface soon, but I don't believe them anymore. I want to go home, but I can't remember what home looks like." The personal effects box also contained correspondence between project officials discussing the Silent Valley subjects with clinical detachment. One memo, dated January 1963, debated whether to continue the isolation study or terminate the project and relocate subjects to permanent settlement facilities. The phrase "permanent settlement facilities" was crossed out and replaced with "alternative arrangements." Laura's hands shook as she realized what alternative arrangements likely meant. These families hadn't been relocated to new lives in distant states. They had been silenced permanently, their inconvenient knowledge of Project Silent Valley eliminated along with their lives. A noise from above, the scrape of metal on concrete, made her freeze. Someone was at the surface, near the entrance shaft. Scouts' barking echoed down the passage, sharp with alarm. Laura quickly gathered the most important documents and photographs, stuffing them into her pack while listening to footsteps moving around the entrance area. The footsteps were deliberate, searching, accompanied by the sound of equipment being moved. Someone was attempting to seal the entrance, to bury the evidence along with anyone who might be underground. Laura's heart pounded as she realized how vulnerable she was. Trapped in the underground complex, with only one way out. She moved quickly but quietly through the passage, her headlamp off to avoid revealing her presence. At the base of the entrance shaft, she could see artificial light filtering down from above, and hear voices discussing the best way to secure the site permanently. The voices were professional, matter of fact, discussing the elimination of evidence with the same casual efficiency their predecessors had used to document human suffering. Scouts' barking suddenly stopped, replaced by a yelp of pain that made Laura's blood run cold. They had hurt her dog to silence his alarm. The realization filled her with rage that overcame her fear. She climbed the shaft with swift determination, emerging into daylight to find two men in civilian clothes standing over Scout, who lay still beside the entrance. "Ma'am, you need to step away from that area," one of the men said, his voice carrying governmental authority. "This is a contaminated site that poses serious health risks to civilians." Laura knelt beside Scout, finding him unconscious but breathing, a small dart visible in his shoulder. "You shot my dog. Tranquilizer, ma'am, for everyone's safety. Now you need to come with us for medical evaluation and debriefing." The second man held a device that looked like a GPS unit, but was clearly something more sophisticated. The sensor readings confirm extended exposure to underground contaminants. "We'll need to discuss proper decontamination procedures." Laura looked at the men's faces, seeing the same clinical detachment she had read about in the medical records below. These weren't concerned officials protecting public health. These were cleaners sent to eliminate problems and witnesses, just as their predecessors had eliminated the Morrison family. But Laura had advantages her predecessors hadn't possessed. She was a widow with few local ties, someone whose disappearance might not be immediately noticed. But she was also someone who had already shared information with Eleanor Vance, someone who had left traces of her investigation in the library records. "I need to get my dog to a veterinarian," she said, carefully keeping her voice steady. "Ma'am, we have medical personnel who can handle any necessary treatment. Right now we need to focus on your potential exposure to hazardous materials." Laura carefully lifted Scout, his limp form heavier than usual, but still breathing steadily. The tranquilizer had been measured for a dog his size, professional, efficient, designed to incapacitate without killing. Yet, my dog needs immediate veterinary attention. Dr. Richards in town knows his medical history, knows what medications might interact with whatever you gave him. The men exchanged glances, clearly not prepared for a witness who remained calm and made reasonable demands. Their training had probably prepared them for panic, for people who could be easily intimidated or isolated. Laura's steady composure was forcing them to improvise. "Ma'am, Dr. Richards isn't qualified to handle potential contamination cases. We have specialists." "Then I'll follow your vehicle to wherever these specialists are located," Laura interrupted. "But my dog sees a real veterinarian first, or this conversation ends right now." It was a bluff, but one delivered with enough conviction to create uncertainty. The men hadn't expected resistance, hadn't planned for someone who insisted on maintaining connections to the outside world. Their hesitation gave Laura the opening she needed. 5 minutes to get my dog stabilized, then we can discuss whatever medical concerns you have. But we do this properly, with witnesses, with official documentation of your authority and my rights. I'm not disappearing into your system the way the Morrison family did. The mention of the Morrison family changed everything. The men's professional demeanor hardened, their casual authority replaced by something more dangerous. Laura realized she had crossed a line from which there was no return. But she had also established that she wasn't an easy target, wasn't someone who could be quietly eliminated without consequences. The personal effects box in her pack contained evidence that connected Project Silent Valley to crimes that had no statute of limitations. The men standing before her knew it, and now they knew that she knew it. The next few minutes would determine whether Laura became another victim of government secrecy or the person who finally brought justice to the families who had died in the darkness below. Dr. Richards' veterinary clinic occupied a converted farmhouse on the outskirts of Millbrook Falls, its white clapboard siding and red barn doors giving it the comfortable appearance of a place where healing happened naturally. Laura carried Scout through the front door, with the 2 federal agents following at a respectful distance, their presence turning curious glances from other pet owners into expressions of concern and speculation. "Laura, what happened to Scout?" Dr. Richards emerged from an examination room, his weathered hands already reaching for the unconscious dog. At 73, he had been treating animals in Millbrook Falls for 47 years, and his sharp eyes immediately assessed both Scout's condition and the unusual tension surrounding his arrival. "These gentlemen tranquilized him with some kind of dart," Laura said, setting Scout gently on the examination table. "They say it's for safety purposes related to potential contamination, but they won't tell me exactly what they used." Dr. Richards' expression hardened as he examined the dart site and checked Scout's vital signs. "This is a professional veterinary tranquilizer, probably Telazol or a similar combination. Proper dosage for his weight, administered correctly. Someone with medical training did this." He looked directly at the 2 agents. "Who authorized the sedation of a civilian's pet?" The lead agent, who had introduced himself only as Special Agent Morrison, a name that made Laura wonder if it was real or chosen for psychological effect, stepped forward with official credentials. "Dr. Richards, we're conducting a public health investigation related to potential environmental contamination. The animal required temporary sedation to prevent exposure to hazardous materials." "What kind of hazardous materials?" Dr. Richards asked while administering a reversal agent to Scout. Because if this dog has been exposed to something dangerous, I need to know what we're dealing with for proper treatment. That information is classified pending the completion of our investigation." Dr. Richards straightened to his full height. His decades of dealing with difficult clients and emergency situations giving his voice unwavering authority. "Son, I've been practicing veterinary medicine since before you were born, and I've never encountered a contamination scenario where the nature of the contamination was classified. Either you tell me what we're dealing with, or you explain to my lawyer why you're preventing proper medical care." The confrontation created exactly what Laura had hoped for. Witnesses, official attention, and documentation that she and Scout existed and were in federal custody. The other pet owners in the waiting room were watching with obvious interest. Several of them, long-time residents who would remember and discuss whatever they observed. Agent Morrison consulted quietly with his partner before responding. "Dr. Richards, we're dealing with potential exposure to materials related to historical military activities in the area. The classification level relates to national security information from the Cold War period. Cold War materials that are still dangerous 60 years later." Dr. Richards continued his examination of Scout, who was beginning to show signs of consciousness. "That narrows it down to nuclear or chemical contamination. Which is it?" "We can't specify. Then you can wait outside while I treat my patient," Dr. Richards interrupted. "And you can explain to Sheriff Patterson why federal agents are conducting unmarked operations in his jurisdiction without proper notification." Laura felt a surge of gratitude for the old veterinarian's protection, but she also recognized the danger his intervention represented. Dr. Richards was inserting himself into a situation that had already cost lives, offering help that might make him a target for the same elimination the Morrison family had suffered. As Scout gradually regained consciousness, his eyes finding Laura with the confused relief of someone waking from an unwelcome sleep, Dr. Richards lowered his voice to speak privately. "Laura, I've lived in this community my entire life, and I remember when federal officials came through during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were things that happened then that some of us were told to forget, but a man doesn't forget when families disappear overnight. The Morrison family, among others. Jim Morrison was one of my closest friends growing up. When they told us he'd moved his family to Oregon for better opportunities, it didn't make sense. Jim loved this land more than most people love their children. He would never have left voluntarily." Dr. Richards' weathered hands were gentle as he checked Scout's reflexes. "What did you find up there, Laura?" Laura glanced toward the door where the agents waited, then pulled the photographs from her pack. Dr. Richards studied them silently, his expression growing more grim with each image. When he reached the picture of the Morrison children, his hands trembled slightly. "Sarah Morrison would be in her 70s now if she lived," he said quietly. "That little boy Tommy would be about your age." "They didn't move to Oregon, did they?" "No, they didn't move anywhere." Dr. Richards was quiet for a long moment, his experienced hands continuing to examine Scout while his mind processed implications that reached back through decades of silence. "Laura, there are things about that period that some of us have carried as secrets our whole lives. Things we were told were necessary for national security, but that never felt right in our hearts." "What kind of things?" "Medical examinations that weren't requested. Blood tests, psychological evaluations, questions about family history and genetic background. They said it was part of civil defense preparation, making sure the community was healthy enough to contribute to national survival efforts." His voice dropped even lower. "But they were selecting people, Laura, deciding who was valuable enough to protect and who was expendable enough to sacrifice." The words hit Laura like physical blows. The medical records she had found underground suddenly took on new meaning, not just documentation of suffering, but selection criteria for a program that had divided families into categories of worth. "Dr. Richards, do you think they're still making those kinds of decisions?" Before he could answer, Agent Morrison opened the door and stepped back into the room. "Dr. Richards, we need to conclude this examination. Ms. Brennan requires immediate medical evaluation for potential contamination exposure. Scout is fine, Dr. Richards said firmly. No signs of contamination, no adverse reaction to the tranquilizer beyond expected temporary effects. He'll be fully recovered within the hour. Thank you, Doctor. Laura gathered Scout into her arms, feeling his strength returning as he nuzzled against her neck. I appreciate your thoroughness. But Dr. Richards wasn't finished. Ms. Brennan, I'll be checking on Scout's progress personally. Daily visits to ensure there are no delayed reactions to his exposure or treatment. Professional medical follow-up is essential in cases like this. Laura understood the message. Dr. Richards was establishing an official reason to maintain contact, to ensure her continued welfare and witness her condition. The old veterinarian was protecting her the only way he could. Using medical necessity to create accountability, Agent Morrison's expression suggested he understood the maneuver as well, but couldn't object without revealing the true nature of their interest in Laura. That's very thorough. Doctor, Ms. Brennan will be available for follow-up care as needed. As they prepared to leave the clinic, Laura caught Dr. Richards' eye one final time. In his weathered face, she saw the accumulated weight of decades spent keeping secrets, the guilt of someone who had remained silent while neighbors disappeared. But she also saw determination, the resolve of a man who had decided that some secrets were too costly to keep. Walking out into the afternoon sunlight with Scout in her arms and federal agents on either side, Laura felt the strange comfort of knowing she wasn't facing this alone. Dr. Richards's intervention had bought her time and created witnesses, but it had also revealed the scope of what she was challenging. Project Silent Valley hadn't been a single operation affecting one family. It had been a systematic program of selection and elimination that had touched the entire community, leaving survivors who carried guilt and knowledge they had never been allowed to share. The official government correspondence in her pack contained names and details that could expose not just historical crimes, but ongoing cover-ups that reached into the present day. The men walking beside her weren't just protecting old secrets, they were protecting a system that continued to decide which lives mattered and which could be sacrificed for the greater good. As they approached the black SUV that would take her to whatever medical facility they had prepared, Laura realized that her investigation had evolved beyond seeking justice for the Morrison family. She was now challenging the fundamental premise that government authority justified any action, no matter how cruel, when presented as necessary for national security. The question that haunted her, as Scout stirred more fully awake in her arms, was simple but terrifying. If they were willing to eliminate entire families 60 years ago, what were they willing to do now to protect those secrets? The federal facility they brought Laura to wasn't the sterile government complex she had expected, but a converted conference room in the Millbrook Falls Community Center, complete with familiar folding chairs and the lingering scent of last night's potluck dinner. The normalcy of the setting made the situation more unsettling rather than less, as if ordinary civic life was being used to disguise extraordinary violations of civil rights. Agent Morrison sat across from her at a folding table while his partner operated recording equipment that looked far more sophisticated than the borrowed venue suggested. Scout lay at Laura's feet, fully recovered but maintaining protective proximity to his human companion. Ms. Brennan, we need to discuss your unauthorized access to a restricted federal site, Morrison began, his tone attempting professional courtesy while his eyes remained cold with calculation. For your own safety and the safety of others, we need to understand exactly what you encountered and what materials you may have been exposed to. Laura had used the drive from Dr. Richards' clinic to consider her approach. These men had expected to find either an easily intimidated civilian or someone they could quietly eliminate. Instead, they had found someone who insisted on proper procedures, who created witnesses, who refused to disappear into their system without accountability. Before we discuss anything, I need to see your official authorization for this investigation, she said calmly. Proper credentials, legal justification for detention, documentation of my rights in this process. Morrison exchanged glances with his partner before producing a folder of official-looking documents. Laura examined them carefully, noting details that confirmed her suspicions. The authorization was recent, dated only 3 days ago, suggesting her investigation had triggered rapid response protocols. The signatures belonged to officials in agencies she had never heard of, bureaucratic entities that seemed designed to operate without public oversight. This authorization mentions potential contamination from Project Silent Valley. Laura said, looking up from the documents. Yet you've been claiming this is about unspecified environmental hazards. Which is the truth? The question created visible tension. Morrison had clearly not expected her to possess enough information to challenge their cover story. His professional mask slipped slightly, revealing someone who was improvising responses rather than following established protocols. Ms. Brennan, how much do you know about Project Silent Valley? I know it was a government program that resulted in the deaths of innocent families, including children. I know it involved forced relocation, medical experimentation, and systematic elimination of witnesses. I know it was documented in official records that were supposed to remain classified indefinitely. Laura pulled the child's diary from her pack, opening it to one of Sarah Morrison's final entries. I know that a 10-year-old girl named Sarah Morrison died underground because officials decided her family was expendable for the greater good. Morrison's partner, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward with evident interest. Ma'am, where exactly did you find that diary? In the underground facility where the Morrison family was imprisoned until they died. Along with medical records documenting their deterioration, correspondence between officials discussing their disposal, and evidence of similar operations involving other families. The admission changed the atmosphere in the room dramatically. Morrison's careful professionalism evaporated, replaced by the focused intensity of someone dealing with a crisis that threatened carefully maintained secrets. Ms. Brennan, you need to understand that Project Silent Valley was a classified operation conducted during a period of national emergency. The decisions made during that period were necessary for national survival during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The decisions made during that period were murder, Laura replied, her voice steady despite her growing anger. You imprisoned families, subjected them to medical experiments, and killed them when they became inconvenient. There's no national security justification for murdering children. Morrison stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over Millbrook Falls' main street. You don't understand the context. In October 1962, the world came within hours of nuclear war. Every decision, every action was made with the knowledge that civilization itself was at stake. So you selected families to sacrifice for the greater good. We selected families who posed security risks, who lived in areas required for essential operations, who couldn't be relocated safely without compromising other activities. Morrison's voice carried the rehearsed quality of someone who had justified these actions many times before. The underground facility was designed to keep them safe and contained until the crisis passed. But the crisis did pass. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended in October 1962. Why weren't the families released? The question hung in the air like smoke from an old fire. Morrison returned to his seat, his expression revealing someone who had reached the limits of official justification and was moving into more dangerous territory. The nature of their confinement meant they possessed information that remained classified. Even after the immediate crisis ended, they had observed activities, heard conversations, witnessed operations that required ongoing secrecy for national security purposes. Laura felt sick as the full scope of the government's logic became clear. So you kept them imprisoned indefinitely because they had seen too much. And when keeping them imprisoned became impractical, you eliminated them entirely. Ms. Brennan, you're making accusations about events that occurred during a different era, under different leadership, with different protocols. The current investigation is focused on preventing similar contamination risks in the present day, but Laura could see through Morrison's attempt to distance current operations from historical crimes. The authorization documents, the rapid response to her investigation, the professional efficiency with which they had tracked and confronted her, all of it indicated that Project Silent Valley's oversight structure remained active and operational. Agent Morrison, who authorized the current investigation? Who decided that my discovery of historical evidence constituted a present-day security threat? Morrison's silence was answer enough. The same bureaucratic machinery that had eliminated the Morrison family was still functioning, still making decisions about which civilians posed acceptable risks and which required management. Laura's investigation hadn't just uncovered historical crimes. It had triggered contemporary response protocols designed to protect those crimes from exposure. She thought of Dr. Richards, of Eleanor Vance, of the other community members who had lived with fragments of truth their entire lives, never knowing the complete picture but carrying guilt for their silence. The system that had destroyed families in 1962 was still operating, still evaluating threats, still prepared to eliminate problems that threatened its secrets. "What happens to me now?" Laura asked. Though she suspected she already knew the answer, Morrison consulted with his partner in whispers before responding. "Miss Brennan, you've been exposed to classified information that poses significant national security risks. We need to discuss options for ensuring that information doesn't compromise ongoing operations or endanger other civilians." The euphemisms were familiar from the documents she had found. Underground, the same language officials had used to justify eliminating the Morrison family. Laura was being offered the choice between voluntary silence and involuntary elimination, presented with the illusion of options, while being maneuvered toward the same fate that had befallen every other civilian who had learned too much about Project Silent Valley. But Laura had advantages. The Morrison family hadn't possessed. She had created witnesses, established connections, built accountability that would make her disappearance noticeable and questionable. She had also documented everything, creating evidence that existed beyond her personal knowledge or testimony. "Agent Morrison, I need to be clear about something. I'm not the only person who knows about Project Silent Valley. I've shared information with others, created records that exist independently of my continued cooperation. If something happens to me, if I disappear or suffer an accident, those people will know exactly why." Morrison's expression revealed someone who had hoped for easier resolution but was prepared to deal with complications. "Ma'am, we're hoping to avoid any unpleasant outcomes. But you need to understand that some information is too dangerous to remain in civilian hands, regardless of the personal consequences." Laura looked at Scout, who was watching the agents with calm alertness, ready to protect her if necessary. She thought of David, of the walking stick he had carved with such care, of the mountains where she had found healing and purpose. She thought of Sarah Morrison's diary, of a child's voice crying out across decades for justice that had never come. "Agent Morrison, I understand exactly what you're threatening, but you need to understand something as well. I'm not going quietly into your system the way other families did. If you want to eliminate me, you'll have to do it publicly, obviously, in a way that creates exactly the kind of attention you're trying to avoid." The standoff was complete. Laura had forced them to choose between allowing the truth about Project Silent Valley to emerge or creating a contemporary crime that would draw investigation to the historical ones they were trying to protect. The next decision would determine whether justice finally came to Millbrook Falls or whether the machinery of government secrecy claimed another victim in its endless effort to protect itself from accountability. That evening, after the agents had reluctantly released her with warnings about the consequences of sharing classified information, Laura sat in her living room with Scout beside her, staring at the cardboard box she had never opened. David's personal effects, the items the hospital had gathered after his death, had been waiting on the closet shelf for 3 years, while she found the strength to face the final remnants of their life together. Now, with the weight of Sarah Morrison's diary in her lap and the echo of Agent Morrison's threats still ringing in her ears, Laura felt drawn to the box with an urgency she couldn't explain. Perhaps it was the need for connection to David during this time of crisis, or perhaps some intuitive sense that the timing was more than coincidental. The box contained the expected items: his wallet, wedding ring, the reading glasses he had worn for the last 5 years of his life. But at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic hospital bag, was something she had never seen before: a small metal key and an envelope marked "For Laura, open only after reading room 237 files." Laura's hands shook as she examined the key. It looked like it might fit a safe deposit box or filing cabinet, but she had no knowledge of any such storage that David might have maintained. The envelope felt thick, substantial, as if it contained multiple documents. She opened it with the careful precision of someone who sensed that whatever lay inside would change everything. She thought she knew about her life. The first document was a letter in David's familiar handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before his cancer diagnosis. "My dearest Laura, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've discovered something that has led you to questions I could never answer while I was alive. The key opens a storage unit in Coeur d'Alene, Unit 237 at Mountain View Self-Storage. Inside, you'll find documents that explain my connection to the project you've undoubtedly discovered in the forest above our home. I was never the Forest Service contractor I claimed to be. For 37 years, I worked for a classified government program responsible for maintaining and monitoring sites like the one you found. Project Silent Valley wasn't the only operation of its kind, and I wasn't innocent of the crimes committed in the name of national security, but I also wasn't a willing participant in everything that happened. There are things I documented, evidence I preserved, records I saved, because I knew that someday the truth would need to come to light. I chose our cabin location because it kept me close to the site, because I felt responsible for watching over what happened there, because I hoped that eventually someone, preferably you, would have the courage to expose what I never could. The guilt of my involvement contributed to my illness. Laura, the stress of carrying these secrets, of living with the knowledge of what was done to innocent families, ate away at my health as surely as any cancer. But I also held on to the hope that my records, my evidence, might someday bring justice to the people who died because of decisions I helped implement. I love you more than life itself, which is why I could never burden you with this knowledge while I was alive to see the danger it would put you in. But I also know you well enough to understand that once you discovered the truth, you wouldn't rest until justice was served. The storage unit contains everything you'll need to expose not just Project Silent Valley, but the entire network of similar operations that continue to this day. Be careful, my love. The people responsible for these programs are still in positions of power, still making decisions about which lives matter and which can be sacrificed. But be brave as well. The families who died in that underground facility deserve to have their stories told, their deaths acknowledged, their murders prosecuted regardless of how much time has passed. The key also opens my office filing cabinet, the locked drawer I always told you contained boring work documents. Inside you'll find contact information for journalists, historians, and legal advocates who can help you navigate the process of bringing this evidence to light safely. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth while I was alive. I'm sorry you had to discover it this way. But I'm not sorry that you're the one who will finally bring justice to the people I failed to protect. All my love, always, David. Laura read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated. David hadn't been a Forest Service contractor. He had been part of the government machinery that had created and maintained Project Silent Valley. The man she had loved for 32 years, the man whose death had driven her to seek solace in the very mountains where his victims were buried. had been complicit in some of the most heinous crimes she could imagine, but he had also been the one to preserve the evidence that could expose those crimes. His choice to live near the Silent Valley site hadn't been random. It had been penance, a form of self-imposed exile where he watched over the graves of people he had helped to kill. The revelation recontextualized everything about their marriage, their move to the mountains, his increasing depression in later years, even his cancer. David had lived with secrets that had literally consumed him, guilt that had manifested as physical illness, knowledge that had isolated him from everyone, including the wife he loved. Scout sensed her emotional turmoil. Moving closer and resting his head on her leg, with the gentle pressure of comfort offered without questions. Laura stroked his fur absently, while her mind raced through implications that stretched back through decades of shared life. Had David known she would find the pipes eventually? Had he positioned their daily walks to pass near the site, hoping that eventually her curiosity would lead her to the discovery he couldn't make himself? The walking stick he had carved with such care suddenly seemed less like a hiking aid and more like a guide, pointing her toward truths he could never speak aloud. The second document in the envelope was a detailed map showing not just the Silent Valley site, but locations of similar facilities throughout the Pacific Northwest. Dozens of sites, each marked with dates and brief descriptions. Family relocation medical study, civilian containment observation, population control genetic research. The scope of operations revealed a systematic program of human experimentation that had used ordinary American families as unwitting subjects for decades. The third document was, perhaps the most disturbing, a personnel file with David's photograph and employment history, showing his progression from junior technician to site supervisor to regional coordinator. His responsibilities had included civilian management, security protocol enforcement, and evidence containment, euphemisms that barely disguised involvement in kidnapping, imprisonment, and murder. But stapled to his personnel file was something else: detailed incident reports documenting David's growing resistance to program protocols, his attempts to improve conditions for detained families, his formal complaints about medical procedures and elimination policies. The reports revealed a man who had started as a true believer in government authority, but gradually awakened to the moral horror of what he was helping to accomplish. His final report, dated December 1963, was a formal resignation letter that accused program leadership of systematic violation of constitutional rights, criminal endangerment of civilian populations, and premeditated murder of American citizens. The letter concluded with his threat to expose the entire operation if he wasn't allowed to leave with guarantees of safety for himself and any future family members. Apparently, they had allowed him to leave but kept him under surveillance. His marriage to Laura, his move to the mountains, his choice to live quietly as a Forest Service contractor, all of it had been carefully monitored by the same agencies that continued to operate similar programs. David's apparent freedom had been an illusion, maintained only as long as he kept silent about what he knew, but David had not remained entirely silent. The map showed locations where he had hidden additional evidence caches, dead drops containing documents and photographs that could expose the full scope of government crimes. He had spent the last 37 years of his life secretly documenting everything he could access, creating a comprehensive archive that waited only for someone with the courage to bring it into the light. Laura looked around the living room, where she and David had spent thousands of quiet evenings, reading by the fire, planning their days, sharing the comfortable intimacy of long marriage. How many of those evenings had he spent wrestling with the knowledge of what he had done, what he continued to know, what he could never tell the person he loved most? The man who had taught her to find peace in the mountains had been seeking his own peace, trying to atone for crimes he could never fully confess. His love for the wilderness hadn't been simple appreciation for natural beauty. It had been the desperate need of someone who had participated in the worst of human nature to Reconnect with something pure and healing. The final document. In the envelope was a current newspaper, clipping from just 6 months before David's cancer diagnosis. The headline read, "Environmental Group Challenges Government. Land Use in Pacific Northwest," and the article detailed legal efforts to gain access to federal sites that had been closed to public access for decades without explanation. David had highlighted certain passages, including quotes from environmental lawyers who suspected the sites contained evidence of illegal government activities. In the margin he had written, "They're getting close. Time running out. Laura will know what to do." Laura sat in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the wreckage of everything she had believed about her life, her husband, and her community. David hadn't just known about Project Silent Valley. He'd been one of its architects, one of its enforcers, one of the people directly responsible for the deaths of families like the Morrisons. But he had also been the person who preserved the evidence that could bring justice to their memories, who had positioned her to discover the truth, who had spent the last decades of his life trying to create the possibility of redemption for crimes that seemed beyond forgiveness. The hospital medical records she had found underground suddenly took on new meaning. David's name appeared in several of the documents, not as an observer, but as a supervisor responsible for medical protocol implementation. He had overseen the systematic documentation of human deterioration, had authorized medical procedures that amounted to torture, had signed reports that tracked families' decline toward death with clinical precision, but other documents revealed a different side of his involvement. Medical orders countermanded, supply requests that exceeded authorized quantities, unauthorized comfort measures that violated protocol. David had been fighting for the families, even while participating in their destruction, using his position to minimize suffering when he couldn't prevent it entirely. Laura found herself crying, not just for the Morrison family and the other victims, but for David, who had carried this burden alone for 37 years. She cried for their marriage, built on love but shadowed by secrets that had slowly poisoned the man she thought she knew. She cried for the mountains they had walked together, where every step had taken him past the graves of people he had failed to save. But gradually, through her tears, she began to understand what David had really given her. Not just evidence of historical crimes, but the tools to expose an ongoing system that continued to operate in shadows, continued to make decisions about which lives mattered and which could be sacrificed. The agents who had questioned her today weren't just protecting old secrets, they were protecting current operations. The same bureaucratic machinery that had eliminated the Morrison family was still functioning, still ready to eliminate new threats to its secrecy. David's evidence cache represented more than historical justice. It represented the possibility of stopping a system that continued to violate civil rights, continued to treat American citizens as expendable resources in service of abstract national security goals. Laura looked at Scout, who had remained patiently beside her throughout her emotional revelation. "What do you think, boy? Do we finish what David started?" Scout's response was a gentle nudge against her hand, the same gesture of comfort and encouragement he had offered during the darkest days after David's death. But this time, Laura understood it differently. Scout hadn't just been comforting her grief. He had been preparing her for this moment, this choice, this opportunity to transform private sorrow into public justice. The key to Storage Unit 237 felt warm in her palm, metal heated by the intensity of her grip. Tomorrow, she would drive to Coeur d'Alene and retrieve whatever evidence David had preserved. She would contact the journalists and legal advocates whose information he had saved. She would begin the process of exposing not just Project Silent Valley, but the entire network of operations that treated American citizens as experimental subjects. But tonight, she would sit with the complicated grief of learning that the man she had loved was both perpetrator and witness, both criminal and confessor, both destroyer and redeemer. David had given her the burden of truth along with the tools to bear it, the responsibility of justice along with the power to achieve it. The walking stick he had carved leaned against the wall where she had left it that morning. Its familiar weight, suddenly symbolic of something deeper than marriage or memory. David had shaped it to guide her steps, but he had also shaped her life to guide her toward this moment, when she would have to choose between comfortable ignorance and dangerous truth. Outside, the mountains stood silent against the star-filled sky, holding their secrets close as they had for decades. But Laura now understood that some secrets were meant to be revealed, that some truths were worth any risk to bring into the light. The Morrison family and all the others who had died in underground darkness deserved to have their stories told, their murders acknowledged, their killers held accountable regardless of how much time had passed or how powerful the institutions that had protected those killers had become. David had spent 37 years preparing for this moment, building evidence and positioning resources for someone who would have the courage to act when action became possible. He had chosen Laura not despite her grief, but because of it, because someone who had learned to carry the weight of loss would be strong enough to carry the weight of truth. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight, Laura would grieve for the husband she had lost twice, once to cancer, once to the revelation of who he had really been. But she would also honor his final gift, his last attempt to transform a lifetime of compromise and complicity into something that might bring healing to the families he had failed to protect while he was alive. The drive to Kerr. Deline took Laura through mountain passes that David had always insisted on taking the long way around, scenic routes that added an hour to their journey, but revealed vistas, he claimed, were worth any delay. Now she understood that those detours hadn't been about scenery. They had been reconnaissance trips. Opportunities for him to check on other sites in his network of hidden evidence. Mountain View Self-Storage sat on the outskirts of the city, a facility so unremarkable that it seemed designed to be forgotten. Unit 237 was tucked away in the back corner, isolated from the main traffic patterns and shielded from casual observation by larger storage units containing boats and RVs. The key turned with the smooth precision of regular maintenance, revealing a space that David had clearly visited frequently over the years. Unlike the cluttered chaos typical of storage units, this one was organized with military efficiency. Filing cabinets lined the walls. Labeled boxes were stacked in precise rows, and a small desk held equipment for digitizing documents and photographs. Laura's breath caught as she realized the scope of what David had assembled. This wasn't just evidence about Project Silent Valley. It was a comprehensive archive of government programs spanning 4 decades, documenting systematic violations of civil rights that reached into the highest levels of federal authority. The encrypted hard drive sat in the center of the desk, connected to a computer system that hummed quietly in the climate-controlled space. A note in David's handwriting explained the password, Laura 1990, the year of their wedding, when he had promised to love and protect her, while secretly carrying the burden of crimes he could never confess. Laura powered up the system with trembling fingers, watching as file directories revealed the true extent of David's documentation. Project Silent Valley was just one folder among dozens, each containing evidence of operations that had targeted American civilians for detention, experimentation, and elimination. The files revealed a horrifying pattern. Government agencies had spent decades perfecting methods of population control, testing procedures on isolated communities, refining techniques for eliminating inconvenient witnesses. The operations had different names: Project Silent Valley, Operation Deep Shelter, Program Northwood, but they shared common elements of secrecy, civilian targeting, and official cover-up. David's personal logs provided context for each operation, explaining his role and documenting his growing horror at what he was helping to accomplish. Early entries showed a young man who believed in government authority, who accepted assurances that extreme measures were necessary for national security. Later entries revealed someone who had awakened to the reality that he was participating in systematic murder disguised as patriotic duty. One entry from 1963 stopped Laura cold. Recommended termination of Silent Valley operations based on moral and legal concerns. Request denied. Informed that continued participation is mandatory for personal safety and security of family members. They've made it clear that resistance would result in elimination of threats to operational security, including spouses and dependents. Laura doesn't exist for them yet, but if I marry her, she becomes leverage. God help me, I'm going to marry her anyway because I need something pure in my life to balance the evil I'm part of. Laura sat back in the storage unit chair, understanding finally why David had waited until his 40s to marry, why he had sometimes seemed to guard their happiness with desperate intensity, why he had chosen to live so far from other people. He had been protecting her from the very beginning, building a life together that was deliberately isolated from the machinery of government secrecy that had claimed his soul. But the files also revealed David's secret resistance activities. For 37 years, he had systematically documented everything he could access, copying records, photographing evidence, building a comprehensive case against the programs he had been forced to help implement. He had created backup copies of classified materials, maintained contact with other resistance members within the system, and developed networks of journalists and legal advocates who could eventually bring the evidence to light. The most recent files, dated just months before his cancer diagnosis, showed David's increasing urgency about exposing the programs. Environmental groups were pressing for access to federal sites. Investigative journalists were asking questions about missing families. And congressional oversight committees were beginning to examine Cold War-era civil rights violations. Time running short, one entry read. New operations being planned using updated protocols based on lessons learned from Silent Valley and similar programs. Current administration appears willing to revive civilian detention programs under terrorism prevention justifications. If I don't act soon, everything we learned about population control will be implemented on a much larger scale. Laura found herself crying again, not from grief this time, but from rage at the magnitude of government crimes David had documented. Hundreds of families had been eliminated over the decades. Thousands of lives destroyed by programs that treated American citizens as laboratory subjects in ongoing experiments with social control and population management. But David's files also contained something else, evidence that the programs were being revived. Current operational plans, budget allocations, personnel assignments, all pointing to new initiatives that would use modern technology and updated legal justifications to implement the same basic procedures that had destroyed the Morrison family and so many others. The hard drive contained contact information for investigative journalists at major newspapers, civil rights attorneys with security clearances sufficient to handle classified materials, and congressional staff members who specialized in oversight of intelligence operations. David had spent years building a network of allies who could handle explosive revelations safely and effectively. Among the contacts was a name Laura recognized, Senator Patricia Whitfield, whose family had lived in Millbrook Falls during the 1960s before moving to pursue political careers in Washington. The files revealed that Whitfield's younger sister had been among the children selected for observation and evaluation during the Silent Valley period, but had been released when their father's political connections made continued detention too risky. David's notes suggested that Whitfield had spent her entire political career positioning herself to expose the programs that had threatened her family, building alliances and accumulating power that could be used to bring justice when sufficient evidence became available. She was now chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, with authority to conduct closed-door hearings that could examine classified materials without compromising ongoing security operations. Laura realized that David had planned not just evidence collection, but evidence presentation. He had identified the exact people who possessed both the motivation and authority to act on what he had discovered. who could navigate the complex politics of exposing government crimes without creating national security crises that would be used to justify continued cover-ups. The final folder on the hard drive contained David's instructions for Laura, detailed procedures for safely contacting allies, transferring evidence, and protecting herself during the exposure process. He had anticipated every possible scenario, from cooperative government response to active elimination efforts, providing her with resources and procedures for each possibility. But he had also included something more personal. Video files recorded during his final months, messages intended specifically for Laura that explained not just what he had done, but why he had done it, and what he hoped she would accomplish with the evidence he was leaving her. Laura activated the first video, seeing David's familiar face on screen, but noting the weight of illness and guilt that had already begun consuming him from within. His voice was steady but hollow, the sound of someone who had carried unbearable knowledge for too long. Laura, if you're watching this, it means you've found the evidence and you're considering whether to expose it. I know this revelation about my past has shattered everything you thought you knew about our life together. About me, about the reasons we ended up living where we did. He paused, his eyes showing the accumulated pain of decades spent complicit in atrocities. I want you to know that everything good in our marriage was real. My love for you, our happiness together, the peace we found in the mountains, none of that was performance or manipulation. It was redemption, Laura. You were my redemption for crimes I could never fully atone for. The video continued with David explaining his strategic thinking, his analysis of current political conditions, his assessment of which allies could be trusted and which approaches were most likely to succeed. But what struck Laura most was his absolute confidence in her judgment, his faith that she would make the right decisions about how to proceed. I chose our home location because it kept me close to the evidence, but I also chose it because I knew that eventually you would find what I had hidden. Not because I planned for you to find it, but because I know who you are. Laura, you're someone who notices things that don't belong, who asks questions when answers don't make sense, who refuses to accept easy explanations when people are suffering. David's voice became stronger, more determined as he continued. The people who died in Silent Valley and the other programs deserve justice, but more importantly, the people who are alive today deserve protection from systems that continue to treat civilian lives as expendable resources. This evidence isn't just about historical crimes, it's about preventing future ones. Laura watched until the final video file finished, then sat in the quiet storage unit surrounded by 40 years of carefully preserved evidence. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but so was the clarity of purpose. David had given her everything she needed to expose not just Project Silent Valley, but the entire network of programs that had operated in shadows for decades. Outside the storage unit, evening light was fading over the mountains that had been her refuge and were now her calling. Tomorrow, she would begin contacting David's allies, transferring evidence to people with the power and courage to act on it. She would start the process that would bring justice to the Morrison family and protection to countless others who might otherwise become victims of government programs that viewed citizen lives as acceptable casualties. But tonight, she would prepare for the most dangerous phase of her journey. The people responsible for these programs had killed to protect their secrets for 40 years. They wouldn't hesitate to kill again to prevent exposure, especially when that exposure threatened not just historical accountability, but the continuation of current operations. Laura carefully powered down the computer system and locked the storage unit, keeping only the essential evidence she would need for immediate contact with David's allies. The hard drive went into her backpack, along with the most compelling documentation of government crimes and the contact information for people who could help her survive the process of bringing those crimes to light. As she drove back toward Millbrook, falls through mountain darkness, Laura felt the transformation that had been building since she first found the pipes in the forest. She was no longer just a widow seeking meaning in wilderness walks. She was the guardian of truth that could expose decades of government crimes. The voice that would finally speak for families who had been silenced forever. The walking stick David had carved waited in her cabin, but Laura knew she wouldn't need it for guidance anymore. She had found her path, and it led toward justice that was 40 years overdue. The Washington Post newsroom buzzed with controlled urgency as Laura sat in a secure conference room, watching investigative journalist Marcus Chen review the documents that would reshape American understanding of government accountability. Chen had been one of David's carefully selected allies, a reporter who specialized in intelligence oversight and had spent 15 years building sources within the national security apparatus. Mrs. Brennan, what you've brought us represents one of the most significant intelligence breaches in modern American history, Chen said, his fingers moving carefully through photographs of the Morrison children, medical records documenting their deterioration, and official correspondence discussing their elimination. But publishing this will trigger responses from agencies that have killed to protect these secrets for 40 years. Laura had spent sleepless nights preparing for this moment, rehearsing arguments that would convince Chen and his editors that the story was worth the inevitable retaliation. Mr. Chen, those agencies are still operational. They're still making decisions about which civilian lives are expendable. If we don't expose this now, how many more families will disappear into programs that don't officially exist? The live television broadcast equipment filled one corner of the conference room, cameras and lighting that would carry Laura's revelations to millions of viewers simultaneously. The Post had coordinated with congressional allies to ensure that Laura's testimony would receive official protection, that senators with oversight authority would be asking questions that created legal shelter for her disclosures. Senator Patricia Whitfield appeared on screen via secure video link from Capitol Hill, her expression grave with the weight of someone who had spent decades preparing for this moment. Mrs. Brennan, I want you to know that the Senate Intelligence Committee is prepared to provide full protection for your testimony today. We've been investigating irregular activities by agencies that have operated without proper oversight for too long. Thank you, Senator. I hope you understand that what I'm about to reveal connects directly to programs that affected your own family during the Silent Valley period. Whitfield's composure slipped slightly, revealing the personal investment that had driven her political career. Mrs. Brennan, my sister Rebecca, was 8 years old when they took her for medical evaluation in 1962. She never fully recovered from whatever they did to her during those 3 weeks. This committee exists partly because of what happened to children like Rebecca and families like the Morrisons. Chen activated the broadcast equipment as Laura prepared to speak directly to the American people about crimes their own government had committed against citizens who had trusted official authority. The red light of the main camera felt like a threshold between the private grief she had carried alone and the public accountability that David's evidence could finally demand. Good evening. My name is Laura Brennan, and I'm speaking to you from the Washington Post newsroom about government programs that have operated in secret for 40 years. Programs that have systematically violated the constitutional rights of American citizens in the name of national security. Laura held up the photograph of the Morrison family, their faces frozen in a moment of happiness before government officials decided they were expendable. This is the Morrison family, Jim, Kate, 10-year-old Sarah, and 8-year-old Tommy. In October 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, they were removed from their home in northern Idaho and imprisoned in an underground facility called Project Silent Valley. They were told it was for their own protection, that they were contributing to national defense by participating in temporary relocation. She paused, allowing the gravity of what she was about to reveal to settle over viewers who still trusted government assurances about citizen protection. The Morrison family died in that underground facility. All of them. They were subjected to medical experiments, psychological observation, and systematic isolation that ultimately killed them. Their deaths were documented by officials who viewed their suffering as valuable data for future population control operations. The documents Laura displayed showed the progression of government crimes, from initial detention, through medical experimentation, to final elimination of witnesses who had seen too much. Each page represented lives destroyed by bureaucrats who had convinced themselves that national security justified any action, no matter how cruel. Project Silent Valley wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a network of programs that tested population control methods on American families, refining techniques for civilian detention, medical manipulation, and witness elimination that continue to influence government operations today. Senator Whitfield's voice came through the secure link with controlled anger. Mrs. Brennan, can you confirm that these programs are still operational, still targeting American citizens? Yes, Senator. The evidence shows that current administrations have revived and updated these programs, using modern technology and terrorism prevention justifications to implement the same basic procedures that killed the Morrison family. The machinery of civilian targeting that destroyed families in the 1960s is still functioning, still making decisions about which lives matter and which can be sacrificed. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, spreading through newsrooms and government offices, reaching viewers who had never imagined that their own government might view them as expendable resources. In service of abstract security goals, Chen leaned forward, with the focused intensity of someone who understood the historical significance of what was being revealed. Mrs. Brennan, you've stated that your late husband was involved in these programs. Can you explain how you obtained this classified information? Laura thought of David's walking stick, of the mountains, where he had sought redemption for crimes he could never fully confess, of the love that had existed alongside secrets that had slowly consumed him from within. My husband spent 37 years documenting these crimes because he believed that eventually someone would have the courage to expose them. He gave me the evidence because he knew that the families who died deserved justice, and the families still alive deserved protection from systems that view civilian lives as acceptable casualties. The broadcast continued, with Laura presenting document after document, photograph after photograph, testimony that connected historical crimes to current operations. With each revelation, she felt the weight of David's burden lifting, transforming from private guilt into public accountability that could finally bring justice to voices that had been silenced for decades. 3 months after Laura's televised testimony, the Senate Intelligence Committee hearing room was packed beyond capacity as families whose relatives had disappeared during the Cold War era came forward to share their own stories of loss and government betrayal. What had begun as revelation about Project Silent Valley had evolved into a comprehensive examination of decades of civilian targeting programs. Eleanor Vance sat in the front row, her weathered hands clutching a photograph of Kate Morrison from their childhood friendship. She had become one of the most compelling witnesses, her librarian's precision and institutional memory providing detailed context for the systematic erasure of families from official records. Senator Whitfield, I want to be clear about what happened in Millbrook Falls during 1962 and 1963, Eleanor testified, her voice steady with the authority of someone who had carried secrets for 60 years and was finally free to speak them. Local officials were told that certain families posed security risks, that their temporary relocation was essential for national defense. We were sworn to secrecy, told that asking questions would endanger ongoing operations. Dr. Richards occupied a seat near Eleanor, his medical expertise providing crucial testimony about the systematic health deterioration documented in Project Silent Valley records. The medical files Mrs. Brennan recovered show deliberate experimentation on detained families, including children who were subjected to psychological manipulation and pharmaceutical testing without consent or proper medical supervision. But the most powerful testimony came from unexpected sources, other government contractors who had worked in David's network, people who had maintained silence for decades, but were now coming forward with additional evidence of civilian targeting programs. Their corroborating accounts created an unassailable picture of systematic government crimes that reached the highest levels of federal authority. Marcus Chen observed the proceedings with the satisfaction of someone whose investigative reporting had triggered one of the most significant congressional investigations in modern American history. The Washington Post's coverage had sparked international attention, with human rights organizations calling for criminal prosecution of officials who had participated in civilian detention programs. Laura sat at the witness table, no longer the isolated widow who had stumbled onto buried pipes in the forest, but someone who had become the voice for families who had been silenced by government secrecy. The memorial stone she had placed at the Silent Valley site had become a pilgrimage destination, drawing visitors who came to honor families whose deaths had finally been acknowledged. "Mrs. Brennan," Senator Whitfield said, "your courage in exposing these programs has enabled this committee to identify at least 17 similar operations that targeted civilian populations between 1960 and 1985. Can you speak to the current status of such programs?" Laura consulted the notes David had prepared for exactly this type of official inquiry, his strategic thinking still guiding her testimony months after his evidence had become public. "Senator, the documents show that while specific programs like Silent Valley were officially terminated, the bureaucratic infrastructure that created them remained intact and has been reactivated under different names and justifications." She held up current budget, allocations and personnel assignments that David's network had obtained, showing how lessons learned from Cold War-era civilian detention were being incorporated into contemporary homeland security initiatives. The same agencies that eliminated families in the 1960s are now developing updated protocols for civilian management during national emergencies, using terrorism prevention as justification for procedures that fundamentally replicate the programs that killed the Morrison family. The revelation triggered immediate response from committee members who had assumed that historical exposure would prevent contemporary recurrence. Senator Whitfield's expression showed someone who understood that their investigation had uncovered not just past crimes, but ongoing threats to civilian safety. "Mrs. Brennan, are you stating that American citizens are currently at risk from government programs similar to Project Silent Valley?" "Yes, Senator. The evidence shows that current administrations have legal frameworks and operational procedures in place that could be used to detain, relocate, or eliminate civilian populations deemed threatening to national security interests. The protective constitutional barriers that should prevent such programs have been systematically weakened through legislation that prioritizes security, considerations over individual rights." The hearing room erupted in concerned conversation as the implications became clear. Laura's investigation had revealed not just historical injustices, but contemporary vulnerabilities that threatened every American family. The machinery of civilian targeting that had destroyed the Morrison family was not only still operational, it was more sophisticated and legally protected than ever before. Dr. Richards leaned forward in his seat, his medical training allowing him to assess the psychological impact of Laura's testimony on the packed audience. People were realizing that the government crimes being discussed weren't just historical curiosities, but ongoing threats to their own safety and the safety of their families. Eleanor Vance caught Laura's eye from the audience, nodding with the approval of someone who had spent decades hoping that someone would finally have the courage to speak truths that had been buried too long. The librarian's careful documentation of missing records and disappeared families had provided crucial corroboration for Laura's revelations, establishing patterns of official deception that reached back through generations. As the hearing concluded with Senator Whitfield's promise of comprehensive reform legislation, Laura felt the completion of a journey that had begun with simple curiosity about strange pipes in the forest. The memorial stone she had created for the Morrison family now represented not just their individual tragedy, but the beginning of accountability for government. Systems that had treated civilian lives as expendable resources for too many decades. The families who had died in underground darkness finally had official acknowledgement of their suffering, their stories preserved in congressional records that would ensure their deaths were never forgotten again. More importantly, their sacrifice had exposed contemporary threats that could now be addressed before more families suffered. The same fate, justice had finally come to the mountain, community that had lived with buried secrets for 60 years. And with it came protection for communities across America who had never known how close they were to becoming victims of programs that viewed citizen lives as acceptable casualties in service of abstract security goals. 1 year later, the morning mist clung to the pine boughs with the same gentle persistence that had greeted Laura's walks for so many years. But everything else about her relationship with these mountains had transformed. The narrow trail that had once been her private refuge for healing now bore the official designation, Project Silent Valley Memorial Trail, marked by a weathered wooden sign that directed visitors to the site where American families had died in government custody. Laura walked the familiar path with Scout, whose gray muzzle had grown whiter during the year of congressional hearings, media attention, and the complex process of transforming private grief into public accountability. At 9 years old, he moved more slowly, but with the same steady devotion that had sustained her through the darkest chapters of discovery and revelation. The memorial itself had evolved beyond the simple stone marker Laura had first placed at the site. Congressional appropriations had funded a proper commemoration. Granite panels listing the names of families who had died in Project Silent Valley and similar programs. Interpretive displays explaining the historical context of civilian detention operations. And educational materials that ensured future generations would understand how government secrecy had enabled systematic violation of constitutional rights. But the most meaningful addition was the small garden that had grown around the memorial through contributions from families whose relatives had been discovered. Among the program's victims, descendants of people who had disappeared during the Cold War era had traveled from across the country to plant flowers, trees, and memorial stones that transformed the site from a place of buried secrets into a living tribute to lives that had been erased from official records but not from human memory. Mrs. Eleanor Vance had become the unofficial keeper of the memorial. Her librarian skills applied to maintaining accurate records of the families honored there, and the ongoing research that continued to reveal additional victims of government targeting programs. At 83, she moved carefully among the plantings, tending flowers with the same precision she had once applied to organizing books and preserving local history. Laura, we've received word from the archives in Washington that they found records of 3 more families who were processed through the Silent Valley facility, Eleanor said, looking up from the marigolds she was weeding. The Patterson family from Montana, the Chen family from Oregon, and a single mother with 2 children whose names are still classified, but who appears to have been detained here for almost 6 months. The ongoing discoveries had become routine rather than shocking, each revelation adding to the comprehensive picture of how extensively government programs had targeted civilian populations. Laura had learned to carry the weight of accumulated tragedy without becoming overwhelmed by its scope, focusing instead on ensuring that each newly identified victim received proper acknowledgement and memorial recognition. Dr. Richards made his way slowly up the trail, his 84-year-old legs still strong enough for the walk, but requiring more rest stops than in previous decades. He carried a small bouquet of wildflowers picked from his own garden, a weekly ritual that had begun after his testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee had helped establish the medical evidence of systematic government crimes. "How's Scout doing today?" he asked, kneeling beside the German shepherd who wagged his tail with the enthusiasm that remained unchanged despite his advancing age. "He's good, Doctor." "Slower than he used to be, but still insisting on making the full walk every morning," Laura replied, watching as Scout sniffed carefully around the memorial stones, his behavior suggesting he understood the significance of the place, even if he couldn't comprehend its historical complexity. The trail now attracted dozens of visitors each week, from historians researching government accountability to families seeking closure for relatives who had disappeared during periods of national crisis. Laura had become an unofficial guide, sharing the story of her discovery and the subsequent investigation that had exposed decades of civilian targeting programs. But the memorial trail represented more than historical education or victim commemoration. The congressional investigation sparked by Laura's revelations had resulted in comprehensive reform legislation that strengthened constitutional protections against government overreach, established oversight mechanisms for intelligence operations that affected civilian populations, and created legal frameworks that would make future programs like Silent Valley significantly more difficult to implement and maintain. Senator Patricia Whitfield had kept her promise to pursue comprehensive accountability, shepherding legislation that created permanent congressional oversight of intelligence operations, established victim compensation funds for families affected by historical programs, and mandated declassification of government records related to civilian targeting operations, the new trail marker that had been installed 6 months after the memorial's dedication reflected these broader achievements. Project Silent Valley Memorial Trail, in memory of American families who died in government custody 1962-1965, and in recognition of the ongoing commitment to prevent such crimes through transparency, accountability and constitutional protection of civilian rights. Laura paused at the marker, reading words that connected her personal journey from grief to purpose with the larger movement toward government accountability that her investigation had triggered. David's walking stick, which she still carried on every morning walk, had become more than a tool for navigation. It was a symbol of guidance from someone who had spent his final years hoping that truth would eventually overcome secrecy. The mountains around her held the same peaceful beauty that had first drawn her to seek healing in wilderness solitude, but they now also represented the possibility of redemption, the way that hidden crimes could be transformed into public education, and how individual courage could challenge institutional power structures that had operated in shadows for too long. Scout settled beside her at the memorial, his breathing steady and content as he surveyed the territory that had become their shared mission. Other visitors would arrive soon, families, researchers, students, and citizens who came to understand how democratic institutions could fail when secrecy was prioritized over accountability, and how individual action could restore constitutional protections when institutional safeguards proved insufficient. As the morning mist burned away under strengthening sunlight, Laura felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had transformed personal loss into lasting protection for others. The Morrison family and all the other victims of Project Silent Valley finally had justice, their deaths acknowledged and their stories preserved for future generations who would learn from their sacrifice. The walking stick David had carved with such care leaned against her shoulder, its familiar weight a comfort and a promise that some forms of love transcend individual lives and create meaning that outlasts personal grief. Their marriage had been built on secrets that slowly consumed the man she loved, but it had also been built on love strong enough to guide her toward truth that could heal wounds inflicted decades before they met. The memorial trail stretched ahead of them, inviting visitors to walk in remembrance of families who had died in darkness and in celebration of the light that their sacrifice had finally brought to government operations that had hidden from accountability for far too long. Scout rose when she did, ready for the return journey to their cabin, where another day of correspondence with families, researchers, and advocates waited. But the mountains would always be there, holding their memories and their promise, offering the same healing power that had sustained Laura through grief and guided her toward the justice that 40 years of secrecy had tried to prevent. The new trail marker caught the morning light, its bronze plaque reflecting sunlight that seemed to illuminate not just the memorial, but the entire mountainside where families had once lived in forced darkness. Laura touched David's walking stick one final time before beginning the walk home, feeling his presence not as the weight of secrets carried alone, but as the lightness of truth finally shared. Some discoveries she had learned were worth any price to bring into the light. Some secrets were too costly to keep, and some forms of love created legacies that transformed private sorrow into lasting protection for countless others who might otherwise suffer in silence. The mountains stretched endlessly around her, beautiful and peaceful as they had always been, but now also bearing witness to the truth that no government authority, no matter how powerful, could ultimately silence the voices of people who refused to let injustice remain buried in darkness. Laura and Scout began their descent toward home, toward the continuing work of ensuring that the Morrison family's sacrifice would create lasting change, and toward the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, if you pay attention to things that don't quite belong, you might discover exactly what the world needs you to find.